Previously on Mina's Magic.
Welcome back to my studio. I thought that I would just do a quick little build. You would think I would know myself. No, clearly I don't. This simple little wood set that a 6-year-old could build, it became this.
Spread it with my finger. Some cutting had to happen. Mini wooden puzzle kitchen, black paint, and then your silver, marble patterned contact paper, these really pretty little beads, miniature wooden clothes pegs, and that's the knob. Squashed the living daylights out of it. If it doesn't work, well, you learned from it. I'm not gonna stop now. We're just gonna have to live with that. Wood glue. Hello, lovelies. Welcome back to part 3 of this mini wooden puzzle kitchen build. When at this point the plan has completely spiraled out of control. It's no longer just a simple... was it really ever a simple build? Anyway, that's what we're picking up to with today, and I've jumped right into sewing. This is a tablecloth that I'm attempting to make. It's a nice plain light cotton, so I highly recommend ironing if you're going to be using cotton like this to make the hems a little bit easier. And also maybe hand sew, because yeah, it got stuck again. It just, instead of sewing a nice straight hem, I think it was because it was so thin, it just kept getting pulled into the machine. But I had already sewn the one side fairly successfully, so I was determined to have the other side machine sewn so they would look similar, hence the fight. Thankfully, I also made the tablecloth a little bit longer than it needed to be, so I was able to cut some of that janky end off that got gnarled. Holding it taut like that really helped to keep it from being gobbled. I don't know, maybe Wendy was hungry that day. Either way, for the shorter ends, I ended up hand sewing those because I wasn't gonna machine sew. So for the bench seats, I took some pieces of card that I cut to the same size as the seats, and then I'm using some of that foam packaging. I've used this before on quite a few of my miniatures. I have a lot of that stuff lying around, and I like to use up junk rather than like buy new materials or throw out the old stuff. If I can use it, I hang on to it and I use it. So I've used some tacky glue here, and I am attaching the foam strips, no, the cardstock strips to the foam. There we go. That's the first one, and I've got the second one glued down as well. Once they're dry, I'm using my scissors to just cut them out so that they become like a foam topped piece of card. And that's to give the illusion of like cushion. Not that cushion is really necessary in these miniatures, because, you know, if I'm going to put dolls in them, they don't really have real butts with nerves, so they're not going to feel the difference between whether there's cushion or not. I just think it looks better. It looks a little bit more realistic. So, and it uses up that packaging stuff. I just cut those out. Voila, that's where they're going to go. Okay, so at this point I decided I'm definitely going to make like a kitchen room. And part of that decision was I found these. They're like pre-cut square boards. There was a pack of 6 for $4 at my local Dollarama. I think they're just like particle board, but they looked like they would be the perfect bases for a dollhouse room. So I went ahead, you saw there it was brown on the one side, that's how they come, and then gray. I had painted a layer of gray, and you'll see why in a little bit. I've pulled out some more of that marble patterned contact paper, and you can see I'm cutting it with my craft knife. Yeah, it was difficult. The craft knife really liked to chew up that paper. I did find I needed to use the craft knife in certain places because there's grid markings on the paper that the contact paper sticker part is stuck on. But there's also large chunks of instructions that cover up those grid markers. So as you can see here when I'm cutting with my scissors, like there's certain spots where I can see the grid markings, I can easily cut those with scissors. But then the big chunks where the grid has been interrupted, I have to use the craft knife for. And I found if I cut slowly and as flat as possible, I didn't want to tip the craft knife too far vertically, then it was able to cut pretty well. All that to say that I made these little squares that I am using as tiles for the floor of what will become the kitchen room. So that gray that I painted initially is going to be like the grout lines. So I'm not putting the square stickers exactly side by side. There's a teeny tiny space in between each one for that gray to show through to look like grout, so that this marble will end up looking like tiles. It was pretty fiddly work. I staggered each row, so again it would look a little bit more like how a tile would be laid in a kitchen. When I got to the ends, sometimes I had a smaller or bigger space, so I saved all my little offcuts and I used those around the edges of the room to just fill in the spaces that weren't big enough to fit a full square. Again, so I didn't, waste any of the little offcuts. So I would just stick the offcut down, and if it happened to hang over the edge, like you see there, I just flipped the board over and craft knife sliced that extra off. And then on the other side, I found this part pretty easy to do. I don't know why it was easier to cut against the board and not my ruler, but for some reason this was easier. And voila. Now, this little area that I pointed out, I'm not going to completely tile because I'm planning on putting the hutch there. So anywhere that there's furniture, I don't tile because I had to cut a lot of squares to get enough tiles to completely cover this floor. I didn't want to waste that time by tiling what was going to be covered up anyway. So that's why I left areas untiled. Because as much as I cut the first time, I needed a whole bunch more, and then that load that I cut still wasn't enough. I had to cut even more. So I went ahead off screen after I finished tiling that floor. I put 2 walls in, and those are done with foam board. You can see it's a little janky there. I was having trouble with my craft knife. I ended up snapping the blade off for like a fresh blade, and that helped, but it still isn't perfect. Then I got a bunch of these coffee stir sticks and cut the rounded ends off. Those are going to be baseboards. So I painted those white, just with regular acrylic paint. And I tried to only paint the top edge and the front edge. Then I went ahead with some foam board and tried to cut out a window frame. This is before I snapped the craft knife to sharpen it, and it completely mangled those inside corners. So I went back to the coffee stir sticks with my jewelry pliers, and I cut off first the rounded end so that they would be square. And then I used a emery board or sandpaper, whatever I could find, to sand down those edges so that they weren't all rough and jaggedy. Then I used the foam board frame that I had cut, because that was exactly the size I wanted for a window. I used that as my guide for measuring out my stir stick pieces, and I ended up using the stir sticks for the frame instead, which I actually liked better because it ended up not being as thick as the foam board would have been. Once I finished up with sizing all those pieces, I painted those white as well. So I would have a nice white window. And as you can see, I went ahead and covered the walls with that lovely contact paper that I got for the Barbie room last year. Still trying to use up all my stuff. I also went ahead and put in the baseboards. This is the little shelf that had been at the top of the stove. And you may remember in my last video, I cut that down because I just like the stove looking like a stove better. But I saved those shelf pieces, obviously. Went ahead and stained them. And decided to add a shelf to this kitchen room, which was needed now that it's, you know, a room and not a bunch of freestanding pieces. I used wood glue for that and spread it out with my finger so I didn't get too much. And then stuck it sort of in the corner above where a counter is going to go. You can see I built out a little bit of extra. And for that I used some spare wood pieces from previous kits. This is the window that I made with a calendar page. I glued down a piece of plastic sheeting and the frame, and then glued that on the picture. Oh yes, so as you can see, all the furniture and the baseboards are out because nothing was square and nothing would stay in, so I had to redo that. While I was figuring out how I was going to make that work, I switched up gears by making something else. So I ended up getting a circle. I cut out a circle of foam board and then a smaller circle inside to make a wreath form. And now I'm wrapping it in like this gold colored just leftover yarn. I was gonna say I've used this before for doll hair, but I don't think I have. Well, either way, I'm wrapping it around the foam board wreath frame to give it like a... I wanted it to look like a natural wreath form, like one of those, what do they use, like grapevines or something. And I thought that looked really cute. And what inspired me to make this are these adorable little resin flowers. I have a whole bunch of those. I got those for what did I make? A fairy garden a few years ago. I ended up not liking it and scrapping that project, but that's why I got these. And I've been hanging on to them, and I wanted to use them, and I thought that would be the perfect size to make a lovely little floral wreath for this kitchen. And what do you know? It does look lovely. So I went ahead, used every single color of the roses that I had, and made a little rainbow. Because who doesn't love a rainbow? I also went ahead with the tablecloth and glued it to the table, and then I glued around the edges and tied it up with string just to like anchor it in place while the glue dried. But then it still wasn't laying properly. So I ended up having to like fold the corners. I think you'd call it mitering the corners. I don't know. I folded these little like diamonds into the corners, glued the fabric down, and used those mini clothes pegs to hold it in place until it dried. And then I covered the foam and card bench cushions in this really pretty like teal fabric. Glued that down to the benches, but for whatever reason it wasn't sticking, so that's why I tied some more of that yarn to again sort of clamp it onto the bench so that the cushion would stay. And I think that turned out quite nice. It's got a little bit of a weird texture from where all the strings were, but I think it turned out pretty cute. I also went ahead behind the camera and made a range hood for the top of the stove. I used a Nutella seal. So you can see like there's the gold. It's pretty janky. I had no idea what I was doing. I just kind of folded until it looked the way I wanted it to. So that's as good of a detail as I can give you. And then I moved on to making some more accessories. Now that I've got the whole thing put together, finally. Oh, what a headache it was putting it all together. So I cut some strips out of cardstock, just scrap packaging, and I wrapped the strips around a pen to get it nice and circular. And I used the stove to measure how big I needed the circle to be. And then I cut off the extra and glued it together to make a nice circle of cardstock. It doesn't really matter the pattern or anything because I'm going to paint it in a little bit. I just needed the card. Now a little gob of glue around the base because we're going to be gluing a bottom on this. And for that I used the other half of the packaging. You can see I've already put one down. It's thinner, but made the same way. I wanted to test and see if it would work before filming it. So there it's glued into place. Then I went ahead with wood glue and just filled the inside. And you can see that I did that on the other one because it's like that yellow color already. This just seals the paper to the paper and smooths everything out. While it's still wet, you can reshape it and make sure it's where you want it. And when the wood glue and everything dried, then I cut those shapes off, sanded the end a little bit to smooth it out, but make sure to sand down, not up. Otherwise, you'll end up peeling the bottom off your circle. Now this is going to be a frying pan, so I made a handle for it, which is basically just like a T shape, the top of the T being the part that glues to the pot, and then the bottom of the T being the handle, which I made sort of a teardrop shape. That just gets glued, and I glued that on the seam. So where the strip of card was glued together is where I glue the handle. Now, again, I mentioned this in a previous episode that some of these pieces are going to end up being silver, so I start with a coat of black. And now I'm going in with the silver. I noticed my silver was getting really, really thin, so I added a little bit of white and painted that. I ended up deciding that that was too gray, so I did go back and use silver on top of it. But I actually found that using the gray first helped the silver look more silver, just because the silver is pretty thin at this point. This was really difficult because I wanted the handle of this pot to be black to look like enamel or something like safe to hold, while the rest of the pot was like metal. But yeah, getting a straight line, I don't know why. It just, the paint didn't want to paint in a straight line on that handle. That was very tricky. Turned out really good in the end, though. So this is going to be like a sauce pot, and then you can see at the back there's a soup pot, so it's taller with the two handles on the side. Matte Mod Podge is what I used to seal everything so that it, would be protected and hardened, but not necessarily shiny. I ended up deciding to keep the frying pan black. Originally I was going to make it silver, but then I thought, I like the cast iron look. So I went ahead and Mod Podged that to seal it. The soup pot here, the handles were just strips that I glued the ends and then kind of squished the center so it popped up to look like handles. I hope that makes sense. If not, if I have found any tutorials that helped me in the process of making any of the things that I'm making, I'll link those in the description below so that you can go and watch those videos, after you've watched mine, of course, for more detailed information on each of the things. I can't remember who all helped me out to shout them out right now, but I will list them down below so that you can get a better tutorial. So for the lids, they're just circles that are slightly bigger than the pots, and then I put some hot glue on this plastic lid so I'd have like a dome with that flat part. This is going to be the handle on the lid. So after the hot glue dried, then I went and painted those black. And I made a couple extra. I think I only needed like 2, but I made 5 just to get the bright shape. Because hot glue it can be very difficult to manipulate. Anyway, I used tacky glue to glue the hot glue onto the lids, which have already been painted black, then silver. And the lids are just some more of that cardstock. I've only made 2 lids, one for the sauce pot and one for the soup pot. And then I'm going to go in with the Mod Podge after everything is dried on the lids and seal those. tune in next time for the thrilling conclusion of Mini Wooden Puzzle Kitchen.